Hey guys, welcome back to FED Learning. So far we have covered the fundamental building blocks of Angular, including components, data bindings, routing, pipes, directives, and forms. And in this video, we will dive into two essential concepts that will take your Angular skill to the next level, called services and dependency injection. Under this, we will understand what services are and why they are necessary. Then we will explore the concept of dependency injection and how it works in Angular. Let's start with the definition. A service is a self-contained reusable piece of code that performs a specific task, making it easily shareable across multiple components within your application. In simple terms, a service is a piece of code that you can reuse in many components across your application. Next, let's discuss when should we use a service in an Angular application. Let's explore some scenarios. First scenario is when we want to share data between different components, we can use service. Second, when we need to share business logic across multiple components, then also we can use service. And third, when we need to interact with database such as sorting, retrieving or managing data, we can use a service. Now let's visualize these three scenarios with a diagram and then we will put them into practice. So our first scenario is to share data between different components. Let's assume we are building an Angular application for a social media platform and we have a user data in the form of object. So this data need to share across multiple components. For example, dashboard component which shows the user recent activity, profile component which display the user's detailed profile information such as email, phone number, address, etc. Next, navigation component which display the user's name and profile picture. Therefore, all three components need access to this user data to display their respective content. So in this scenario, we might think of copying the user data and pasting it into all three components. However, this approach goes against the dry principle of Angular, that is, do not repeat yourself. Therefore, instead of copying and pasting the user data into each component, we can create a service that stores the user information. And this service can then be injected into each component, allowing them to access user data. Now let's consider another scenario, sharing business logic across multiple components. So here, suppose we want to implement a feature that checks if a user is eligible for a premium subscription based on their profile information. So initially, we might add a method to components class file to encapsulate this business logic. But if multiple components needs this functionality, then duplicating the code in each component would not be practical. And this is where the service comes in handy. The service can encapsulate the business logic for checking premium subscription eligibility, and then any component that needs to implement this logic can simply inject this service and use its method to determine eligibility. So by sharing the business logic through a service, we can maintain and update it in one place, avoiding code duplication and making our application more efficient. Now let's explore these two scenarios with a practical example and then we will move on to the third scenario. So let me open Visual Studio Code Editor and here let me create a new component called profile and generate component profile. Then inside the component's TypeScript file, I'll add user data object to display dummy data. ID1, name, John, username, John, and email, john@gmail.com. Okay. Now next, in the template file, I'll bind the user data object and display its value to showcase the user's information. Here, let me take one div with class margin 3 and then inside this div, I'll take one UL tag and then li. This li for ID and I'll bind this ID with user data.id. Similarly, I'll bind name, username, and email. Name, username, and last email. Okay. Now save the changes and let's check the result in the browser. Okay, I forgot to add this profile inside the routes. So let me add this quickly inside app.routes.ts file. After this user, I'll add profile and component will be profile component. Now inside app.component.html file, after this user, I'll add one more li for profile. Now save the changes and let's check the result in the browser. Let me navigate to profile component, and as we can see, we have successfully displayed the dummy user data. But now, what if we want to display the only name from this user object in another component, like in data binding component? If I want to display the same name inside this data binding component, then what we have to do? So in this case, we would typically paste the same code into the data bind component class file and bind the names to the template file, just like we have binded with this profile component template file, right? But as we discussed earlier, this approach involves duplicating code across multiple components, and which is not ideal. So to avoid duplicating code across multiple components, we will use a service. So now let's create a service called share data using the CLI command ng generate service as for service and service name share date. Enter, and this command generates two files, a .ts file and a spec.ts file. But we will focus on .ts file which contains a basic service skeleton, and we will add our service logic to this file. Now, in Angular, components use the @component decorator, while services use @injectable decorator to enable dependency injection. And the @injectable decorator tells Angular to inject constructor arguments through its dependency injection system. And what is dependency injection? Dependency injection allows components to receive dependencies rather than creating them manually. And by using dependency injection, we can make our code more modular and reusable. Okay. Now in our service, we use the provided in metadata with the value root. This means that if you are working on a module based Angular application, instead of adding the shared data service to the provider's array of app module, you can create a single instance of this service that can be shared across the entire application. Okay. Now let's move the dummy data from the profile component to the service file. Let me copy this user data and paste it inside service. And I'll comment the user data from profile component TS file. Now, by doing this, our profile component now relies on the shared data service. So to fetch the service data in the component, we first need to inject the service through constructor. So here, let me add constructor, and inside round bracket, let's inject the shared data service. Private service name share data share data service. Okay, so this is how we used to inject the service in component. And injecting the service means we are injecting the dependency, which is the core concept of dependency injection. Now, once injected, we will store the user data in a local variable. So let's create one local variable called dummy data of type any, and let me store the user data into this dummy data. This dot dummy data equals to this dot share data dot user data. So with the help of underscore share data, we are accessing the share data service. And inside share data service, we have added the user data object. Okay. So now we have stored all the user data inside dummy data variable. Now let me bind this dummy data to the template file to display the user data. but this time we will get user data from service, not from component. So let's test in the browser and we can see the same user data in the browser. But this data is coming from share data service. Okay. So this is how we can fetch data from service to component. And now I can easily display the username in the data binding component by injecting the share data service. So let me copy this code and let me go inside the data binding.ts file, and here I'll paste the constructor code. Here we need to import the service, and then with the help of this dummy data I can bind the name. So here let me bind username equals to, using string interpolation, dummy data dot name. Save the changes and let me test in browser. Okay, property topic. Okay, for now I'll comment out this code as well. Now I'll navigate to data binding component, and as expected we can see the same username displayed here as well. Okay, so with this we have completed the demonstration of our first scenario. Now let's move forward and work on second scenario, that is sharing business logic across multiple components. And to achieve this, I'll add a new property to this existing object user data called subscription with the value of basic. Now we have our data and I want to display a message saying you are eligible for premium subscription if the user meets the eligible criteria. And the criteria are: the subscription type is basic and the email address ends with @gmail.com. And I want to implement the same functionality in multiple components. So we will bind this functionality in same profile and data binding components. So to achieve this functionality, what I need to do? I need to write the method in both the profile and data binding component with specified criteria, right? So instead of duplicating the same business logic in both the components, I'll add the logic to the service file, and then using dependency injection, we can access the same logic from any component that needs it. Okay, so let's create a method here called is eligible for subscription. And inside this method, I'll add a conditional statement to check if the user meets the eligibility criteria. So inside if block, I'll add condition this dot user data dot subscription equals to basic, and this dot user data dot email dot ends with @gmail.com. Dot. We need to write this format inside quotes. Now, if these conditions are true, the method will return true. Otherwise, it will return false. Okay, so what I have written here, this is eligible for subscription method will return true only if the user's subscription type is basic and their email address ends with @gmail.com. And this AND operator ensures that both conditions must be met for the method to return true. Otherwise, this method will return false. Now let's call this method in the profile component. And here we have already injected the share data service through constructor. So let's display the message directly in the template file. And to do this, we can add a conditional if statement to check if the user is eligible. So I'll use @if block. And inside this if block, we can either directly call the method like this dot underscore shared data dot this is eligible for subscription, or we can store the result of this method into one variable. Like here I'll create one more variable is eligible of type boolean, and after this dummy data I'll store the result of is eligible for subscription method into this is eligible variable. And now we can bind this is eligible variable to this if block. Okay, so either approach will work. Now Inside this if block, I'll add one h4 tag with Bootstrap class text success. And inside this h4 tag, I'll write the message, you are eligible for a premium subscription. And inside else block, I'll write a message, you are not eligible for premium subscription with class text danger. Okay, now save the changes and let's test in the browser. Let me navigate to profile component. We should see the message you are eligible for premium subscription in green color. But if I change the email address to end with yahoo.com, in this case, the message should change to you are not eligible for premium subscription in red color. So this logic we have used in profile component. Now, if I want to display the same message in data bind component, then I just need to bind this is eligible for subscription method inside the data binding component.ts file. So here, let me create one more variable called is eligible of type boolean. And then I'll copy the if condition block from profile component template file and paste it into data binding component template file. Save the changes and let me navigate to the data binding component, and here you can see you are not eligible for a premium subscription. And if I correct the email ID like gmail.com, then we will receive message you are eligible for a premium subscription in green color. Okay, so with that we have completed exploring our first two scenarios, and in both scenarios we have used service to avoid duplicating code and make our application more efficient. Now let me go back to PPT and let's explore the third scenario, connecting to a database and retrieval operations. And in our previous two scenarios, we worked with dummy data. But in real world project, we typically deal with large amounts of data. And this type of data usually comes from a REST API or backend API. For example, imagine we are receiving the user data from a backend API instead of our dummy data. And to demonstrate this scenario, we will use the JSON placeholder user API. So to fetch data from this API, we need to send the HTTP request to the backend database. Then we will get data as a response in the form of observable. And we will do this in our service file. Once we set up the service, we can inject it into any component that needs the data. But before we implement this third scenario, let's understand how Angular HTTP service architecture works. So let's imagine we have data stored in a database and we have created a service that multiple components will use. But in an Angular project, we create services and components, but we don't create databases. So when we need a data, we add a REST API to our service. However, simply adding a API is not enough. We need to send the HTTP GET request from service file to the database to retrieve the data. And once the database receives the request, it sends the data back to the service as an observable. So let's imagine that now our service holds the data in the form of an observable. But here is the important part. The component can't access the observable data directly into the component class file because observables are lazy, which means they only execute when we subscribe to them. So for our components to access the data, they need to subscribe to the observable. Okay, so this is how HTTP service architecture works in Angular. Our service sends a request to database and service receives the data as an observable, and then our components subscribe to that observable to access the data. So hope you understand the HTTP service architecture. Now let's explore the third scenario with a practical example. So I'll go back to Visual Studio Code Editor and we will continue from there. So the first step is to configure your application to work with REST API. And let me open the app.config.ts file. And if you are not working on a module based Angular application, Then you need to add a provide HTTP client module to the providers array in your app.config.ts file. And this will import from angular/common/HTTP module. So this is our first step in order to work with REST API. Now next step is, let me search the JSON placeholder API and I'll copy this user API and store it in a variable called API data or API URL equals to, I'll paste this URL. Okay. Now next, we need to send the HTTP GET request to the database. Database means this database API. And to send the HTTP request to database, we need to use the HTTP client model. So let's inject the HTTP client model inside the constructor private underscore HTTP colon HTTP client. And after that, I'll define one more method called get user data. And this method returns the HTTP GET request with this API URL. Okay. So let's return underscore HTTP dot get, and inside round bracket we need to pass the API URL. That's it. So with this syntax, we can send the HTTP GET request to the database. Okay. So what is happening here? Our shared data service is sending a HTTP GET request to the database, and the database will respond by sending the data in the form of an observable. This means now our get user data method holds the user data in the form of an observable. And to access this data, component needs to subscribe to this get user data method. So inside profile component, we have already injected the share data service. So now let's subscribe to the get user data method. For this, I'll create new method called get data. And inside this method, I'll call the get user data with the help of share data service. So this dot share data dot get user data. And we need to subscribe to this get user data service because this method is holding the data in the form of observable. And now after this subscribe method, we need to handle the response. So to handle the response, we will use the fat arrow function and store the response in the local variable. So let's create a local variable called API data of type any, and I'll assign this response to API data. Now let's call this get data method in the ngOnInit lifecycle hook. Let's implement ngOnInit lifecycle hook on init, and here I'll define the ngOnInit lifecycle hook. And inside this, I'll call the get data method, because this ngOnInit hook is called once the component is initialized on the web. Okay, so that's all we need to do in our TypeScript file. But don't worry, if some of the concepts are unclear, we will revisit HTTP GET request when we cover CRUD operations later on. Now, let's take a look at API data, and it's currently in an array of objects format. So here inside array, we can see multiple objects. So in our HTML file, we will use for loop to iterate over the API data. And here, let me add comment. This is the example of sharing data across multiple components. And this example is of sharing business logic across multiple components. And third example is interaction with API. Okay. So here, let me copy this UL and comment out this code for now. And I'll paste this UL here, and inside UL, let me use the ng-for directive. Let data of API data. And now I'll bind this ID name, username, and email ID with data. Now save the changes and let's test the list of users in the browser. Let me navigate to profile component. Let me see the error. Can't bind ng-for. Okay. In order to use ng-for directive, we need to import the common module. inside imports array of same component. Okay. Now let's retest. And as expected, you can see all 10 users displayed, which matches the number of users provided by API. We are getting 10 users from this JSON placeholder users API. Okay. So in this example, profile component uses the shared data service to fetch user data from the API when the component is initialized. And the best part is that this service can be shared across multiple components wherever user information needs to be displayed. So with this, we have successfully demonstrated all three scenarios where we can use service in Angular. We can use service to share data across multiple components, to share business logic throughout the application, and to share API data across multiple components throughout the application. And Angular services serves three key purposes. First purpose is code organization, which means services keep your code organized by separating different concerns. Second purpose is reuse, which means services can be shared across multiple components, making it easy to reuse code. And third purpose is dependency injection. Dependency means an object or service that another object relies on. And injection is the process of passing a dependency to an object that needs it. So this makes components more modular, flexible, and easier to test. And how does dependency injection works in Angular? The first step is to register a service with Angular, and this is done using the @injectable decorator or in the @ngModule decorator. Next, when the application starts, Angular creates an injector, and the injector is responsible for creating instances of services. Next, when a component needs a service, it requests it by adding the service to its construct. And then the injector uses the component context to resolve the dependency. After that, if the service instance doesn't exist, the injector creates it. Next, the injector provides the service instance to the component. And last, component uses the service instance to perform tasks. This is how dependency injection works in Angular, and that is all about services and dependency injection. And in the next video, we will learn about CRUD operations where we will use get, post, put, and delete APIs. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to FED Learning for quick and easy learning. Thank you. Bye bye.